life in 3 dimensions got me bent and got me twisted. I know I done said a lot, but I should probably stop pretending. I don't really hold the key and I can't really push a button. I just step up to the mic and try my very best to bust it, but I ran out of breath. It's tight in my chest, my feet just might fail. I can't stand the pressure.
Racially speaking, I'm your host, David Phipps, and I'm excited to be back with you all. Hopefully everyone's enjoying the nicer weather, depending where you're at. Here in the New River Valley of Virginia, it's getting nice out. It's I'm loving the 70-degree weather, although it's a little rainy this morning. But anyway, I'm enjoying the warmer weather, heading into summer. Hopefully everyone is doing well. Man, I want to have this guy on for a while now, and I'm super thankful that the stars have aligned to have him on during one of his off seasons, which we'll get into here on this Wednesday morning. I'm joined by pastor, preacher, worship leader, former wide receiver. Man, I'm in my bag. My friend, brother E.L. Smiling. What's going on, man?
Man, nothing much. Appreciate you for having me. And
absolutely, that was
for
just
an awesome introduction.
Man, that was just off the top of the dome.
A lot
man.
of titles, but appreciate that.
You got to put that in all your profiles when people line you up to speak. Yeah.
I'm just gonna leave it at EL.
EL.
No titles.
And then all right. Well, look.
Well,
that was. I guess it sounded funny, but I wasn't making that stuff up, man. You have a lot of titles. And look, you excel, and I know you're not fishing for compliments. You excel at a lot of these things. The Lord's using you in the church to. I get the privilege to be a part of some of the hats you wear. But worship leader, you do some preaching. You speak kind of all over the place. Former D1 athlete, wide receiver. I was right with that, right? Okay, former wide receiver, Virginia Tech. So you've worn a lot of hats. I'm going to ask you. I'm excited to get in some of these conversations about what's led you to all those different places. So, look, man, let's start here. You're, of course, one of the co-pastors at the church I go to, the Vine Church in Blacksburg, Virginia. If you've listened to the show before, you guys are familiar with listeners. You're familiar with Pastor Vince, so he's one of the other co-pastors of the Vine. One of our good friends. You've been pastoring at the Vine for, we've only been going for about a year and a half at this point. And our listeners know at this point, but the Vine, kind of one of the big foundational backdrops is a multi-ethnic culture that we wanted to be established and felt called to be a part of. When we started planting the church. And so let's start there. I'd wonder, with your background being in ministry, in sports, and then vocationally, there's a lot of crossover for you, which I should have you introduce yourself even a little more than what I did. But I wonder, man, how would you say you got to where you're at as a pastor and doing vocational ministry?
Yeah, great question. My dad is a pastor, and I can remember growing up, the older ladies at church, they would grab your cheek and, say how cute when you're really little, but they would always say, "Oh, you're going to be a pastor just like your dad." And I was like, "No, I'm not." I wouldn't say that, but I would be thinking that. I actually kind of had I had a negative response to those types of things growing up. But I can remember when the Lord just made it clear, and I looked back on those moments like, man, those ladies were right. I'm gonna be a pastor just like my daddy. But I think it started long before I even realized it. I think I was discipled well before I even knew what discipleship was, and so God was planting seeds of pastoral ministry all along. And so I don't really know exactly how I got here. A lot of that is the Lord and him planting seeds and opening doors and I just pointing back to him. He's moved me here, but I could see those seeds being planted a long time ago, even before I could realize it. And even before I was like ordained and kind of officially moving into that pastoral role, I was put in position to lead and to, when I was an athlete, would do Bible studies on campus and with the football guys. And Dave Giddings, one of the other pastors at the Vine, he was my mentor, my guy. He was my discipler throughout college. And he had such a foresight of like, whether you're going to be a pastor or not, I'm going to start planting those seeds and prepping you for pastoral ministry. So he would put me in a lot of leadership positions and just slowly and surely kind of give me the reins to certain things or put me in uncomfortable positions. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think there's a lot of stuff along the way that I didn't even realize was preparing me for pastoral ministry.
That God if you want, go and give like a rundown. Like I said, I summarized briefly all the things you do, but tell our listeners. I skipped over that. What you do vocationally other than pastoring?
Yeah, so you've already introduced pastor and worship leader at the Vine. Worship pastor, if you just want to lump those together. But I work for a ministry called the Fellowship of Christian Athletes at Virginia Tech. So I'm the campus director over our campus and also the men's basketball chaplain. So those are very interconnected, but almost two different. It feels like two different jobs at times, although they're closely linked together. So I get to walk alongside our men's basketball team and we call it the ministry of presence, be at every practice and game and sometimes weightlifting and private workouts, those types of things. I walk alongside the team and kind of oversee development of the ministry across our athletic department. So even those two roles are connected. A lot of the stuff I do as a pastor with the Vine is closely connected with the ministry and vice versa. But coupling that with being a kind of a dad and a husband, no, that's not vocation, but it feels like another.
Now all the church
job,
ladies
are
pinching your little guy, Q's cheeks.
Gets busy pretty quick.
Is anyone telling him he's going to be a pastor too? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Hopefully they're saying some of the same thing. I don't know, but I'll encourage it.
That's awesome. Yeah. And the only reason I don't lump pastor and worship pastor together is because I think, if you're in the Christian world, you hear worship pastor, you just think exclusively music, which, man, you excel at. But if anyone's heard EL preach, man, preaching is a gift for you too. Hope you know that, my guy. So I don't want to. I want to make sure people know that you can preach the word as well as lead us in worship. But thanks for the summary of all the stuff you do, man. I love all the stuff you do. And just to be clear, I definitely don't want to put you in any kind of box. But as relating to this podcast, let's talk about justice a little bit, because I know we align a lot on some of our thoughts and hearts for justice, ministry, multi-ethnicity. And so I'd wonder, with your background, and you shared with me, obviously, off mic, but your heart for, as we've even been able to be a part of planning the Vine Church in Blacksburg and doing some ministry together. One of the common threads we have is, it could have been a church with, any kind of focus, obviously, but something that I think, and we haven't known each other very long, but that led us to doing this somewhat together, was a heart for multi-ethnicity and caring about justice, specifically racial justice, as we were being part of church, planning a church. So I'd wonder if you could share a little bit about what led you to that calling, if you will, that element of pastoring.
Absolutely. You know this, our area isn't the most diverse in the world or even in the country. And so there's a sense which, especially at Virginia Tech, Radford is probably even a little bit further ahead in that space. But at Virginia Tech, there's a different feel in the athletic department versus the entire campus. And then even on our campus versus the surrounding, the NRV itself. So there's a pocket of diversity and multi-ethnicity and multiculturalism almost in these concentric circles. So as a football player, I was able to see a lot of people that look like me, sound like me, come from my background all the time. And then I would go to Kroger and I'm in a different world. And so a part of that, you learn how to navigate. But there's also a sense of wanting to cultivate that without being exclusive, like excluding people, but also kind of just wanting to cultivate that, wanting to feel that support and that love. And I think one of the areas we find that the biggest contrast with that is in church. So even as a student, finding a church, I grew up in a predominantly, mostly all Black church. So coming here, it was night and day from the culture perspective, but also just from the people you see. And so coming here was like a culture shock. And so a part of the church planning vision and calling, obviously it starts with God. He put these seeds in a number of people's hearts well before we got to the point of planning. I can remember 2012, 2013, there was seeds already being planted of this type of church. And so it took a long time, but there was obviously a need. And that is not to shame or really call out any churches in the area. I don't know that it's been at the forefront of people's mind. It's just like, hey, we've got a church, whoever comes. And there hasn't necessarily been an intentional thought to different pockets of culture and ethnicity. So the seeds were planted a long time ago, but I can remember God even confirming this a few years ago. I had a coach that was on the transition. He was getting ready to go to a different school, different area. And he had been coming to our FCA stuff. He would come to our game day chapels and Bible studies, and he would hear me speak, and he would watch the interactions. And he called me for a meeting one day, and he's a praying man. Like, he loves the Lord. He calls me for a meeting, and I'm thinking this is like he needs some advice, or maybe he wants to support the ministry financially. And we get to the meeting, completely shocks me when he's like, I feel like I've been praying and I feel like God has called you to plant a church. And I was like, what? He doesn't know we're already having church planting conversations. But he just kind of mentioned, like, I think you and a number, he doesn't know the other people involved, but he just kind of said, there's a need here for something that kind of just reaches beyond what's already here in terms of culture and race and a number of other things. I mean, we're solidly founded on the Word of God. That's where we're going to make our home. But to be intentionally thinking about culture, race, generation, all of those things has been every step of the way a part of who I am, my experience here in Blacksburg and Christiansburg and the NRV. And I think we see that contrast most starkly in church. I can remember being a part of a few churches where I'm one of 3 people that look like me. And you can get by with, that's not the biggest problem in the world, but it does help to be intentionally thinking about that there's people that come from all over the world, settle here for a few years or maybe for a lifetime, and they don't speak our language. They don't even speak English. And they're constantly going to churches, preferring that culture, always hearing everything in their second language. So just to be able to think through that and hear God's heart for the nations is important.
What's given you you might, I think you did touch on this some, but what made you really feel the call to do multi-ethnic ministry with your background being predominantly African-American church and then coming to New River Valley College and kind of swinging to the other end of a predominantly white church, and then you feeling the call to do multi-ethnic church, you know what I'm saying? So like I would assume, I think you've shared some of this. It might have been other people that from our core planting team, but I'd assume like I think you shared about maybe getting pushback from both payment brought from both sides, and I'd wonder if you can speak into that of what that was or has been like, and what made you just continue to know like, no, this is the type of church we need to establish specifically here, kind of given the background, your personal background and the background of the area. Does that make sense?
Yeah, great question. I think the temptation is being a minority in this area and coming from a background where everybody looked like me growing up, at least in church. Northern Virginia, I grew up in Northern Virginia, so it's a pretty diverse area, but church was, I mean, everybody looked like me. It was the opposite, maybe 3 or 4 white brothers and sisters out of 100. So the temptation is to overcorrect, or maybe even to have some resentment and just kind of create these exclusionary clubs, you know, to make it, let's plan an all black church. But when we look to the word of God, I think what we see is an open door to all the nations. I mean, the gospel starts with the Jews, but it goes out pretty quickly to all the nations. And so I think we could be tempted to respond by saying, nah, let's make a all black church, or an all Korean church, or an all Indian church, or whatever. But we see from the word of God an open door. So instead of overcorrecting, I think it makes sense to go to God's word, say, what does his church look like? And this area is what it is. So we couldn't get there anyway. It's hard to just keep, something God led in an area where it's not super diverse, to keep that one color or culture anyway. So it just makes sense that whoever's here, open the door and try our best to reach them. So that's really the heart behind it, is being led by God and seeing that from the word, that we're made in his image. And that looks a lot different for you and for me and for some of my white brothers and sisters at the Vine. We've got people from all over, but the door is open for all of us because we see that as a gospel command to go and make disciples of all nations.
All right, we're back. I don't know how the previous part is gonna sound. I had a slight technical difficulty of cutting out, so we'll piecemeal this back together. Let's do a little bit more on ministry. These answers have been fantastic, EL. I think where we just were is kind of talking about your heart for calling to multi-ethnic ministry, specifically with your background being in predominantly black church, then moving into the New River Valley and being predominantly white church. And then you unpacked your heart for why you saw the vision for the need of a multi-ethnic place for just people of all cultures, and specifically that coming from just the Bible. So you're not, I love it, not complicating things in any way. So fast forward and reflect a little bit for me. What has been, we'll start with challenges, like what has been something that's been challenging once you got into the trenches? So one thing you do, your main focus is worship leader, like we said. So you're in charge of, the music portion predominantly at church. And there's a lot, I know I get to do some of this with you, but there's a lot that goes into that, man. So like even thinking about the different cultural styles, which we have had a lot of talks about, and they're ongoing. What has been challenging? I don't necessarily mean like pushback. I mean, maybe if there has been, that'd be interesting to hear about. But what's been challenging, with your musical and cultural background being over the whole worship team and vision for the church in general, because that's a lot of different things coming together that's got to work seamlessly when there's it's not a very seamless thing. So what's been challenging about establishing a multi-ethnic worship music culture?
I'm going off the cuff here, but great question, because this isn't a negative thing, but there's a lot of challenges. It's just a part of what we're trying to do. It's hard, it's difficult, and that at times is a really beautiful and good thing. One of the biggest challenges that I try to keep before me in terms of prayer and just a focus is you can easily make it a but instead of a both and. So we want church, Sunday morning worship, or throughout your week. Yeah. We want that always to be Christ-centric. We want it to be built on the character and the work of God. We want it to be built on the word and pointing towards Jesus. And so if you're not careful, that could easily become something that moves away from Christ and more to culture and preference and how well we're doing things. And like, we want to keep it in the backdrop that God is to be glorified and the word is to be preached and heard and beheld. And like, we want to stay looking at Jesus, and not a but and we want the members of our congregation to be heard and their culture and their background to be represented. Mm-hmm. And we want to draw towards our people as well. So the biggest challenge for me is keeping that at the forefront. It's easy to start running the race well, and 5 years down the road, you like all you're thinking about is, well, how can we appease this group, or how can we draw here, and we like not even thinking about Christ anymore. So I think that will always be a challenge. But the more specific challenges, I think, when it comes to Black church, especially worship music, but even just the nuances of preaching, personality, like all of that come into play. And so one of the challenges is gospel music is hard.
Yes. Amen. Do you really believe? Not, look, man, you are a talented musician. Do you think? I know what I think about that. What you just said. Like, do you really think that gospel music is more difficult, like harder to play? Like, I know I do, but I grew up around predominantly white church and white music, like white worship music, and so I'm asking you about, like, as you're cultivating the multiple cultures being represented up there, I think that task is different for you than it is for like our white brothers and sisters on the team, and myself growing up in that culture. I would think it would be, and sometimes like I feel like for you it might be, correct me if I'm wrong, easier just to be like, you know what, let's just do the music that most of my white brothers and sisters are used to. That's easier just to like pivot to and to play, and it's just hard. Or has it been challenging to be like, no, I'm gonna,
For sure.
introduce this gospel song, and we're just gonna run with it and see what, not, practice and stuff, but no, see what happens, knowing that this isn't a predominantly black church, and it's not, the atmosphere isn't even going to be the exact same. It might even, dare I say, like a little bit awkward, but I'm going to dive into that, if I'm you versus, I'm sorry. My first question was like, so I know, I'm like, man, I love learning them. Like if it was up to me, we'd play way more gospel, because I think there's a need for that in our church and for representation. But to me, as one of the people that helps lead, I'm like, it's just, I can't pivot to that in the same way, in my opinion, that you can pivot to some of the music I'm used to. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't even think that's controversial to say. I think it is, like, empirically, like, you can measure. It's harder. There's more chord changes. There's more unfamiliar chords, and even like jazz theory underlaying a lot of the stuff that you would do in a typical gospel song that just isn't present in contemporary or even like older, just the basic hymns. So I think it's not even controversial to say it's harder. It also incorporates different instruments. Like I think that's why, for the most part, either bands for like pretty dynamic gospel choirs or gospel, black churches, are paid, and they spend like hours prepping, or churches just go with like a drum and a keyboard, because it takes a lot for volunteers to try to organize.
Makes total sense.
As much as goes on in gospel music. It's a lot. It's busier, but it's also like in CCM, you can get by with a guitar and drums, or just a guitar, honestly. Whereas gospel music is more focused on the rhythm section, so bass, drums, and keys. And you almost don't even need an acoustic guitar. So you kind of have the problem of like more dynamic, all over the place music, lots of chord changes, but then you even have just the instrument difference. Like it's more keys heavy versus guitar heavy. And then you kind of mentioned this, but having the familiarity. So like for me, I've been hearing this stuff for 30 plus years. For some of our white brothers and sisters, they've been hearing this for like 3 months. This is like the first time they've ever heard some of the artists that I would listen to every day, whether that's in the car, mom's listening to on her way to church or whatever, or just in my own preference. So all of those come together to make a pretty tough challenge. And to your second question, like where do I land in that? I think I vacillate all the time. I go back and forth with like, it's just easier to just do CCM. Like, let's just go. Everybody's more comfortable. It's easier music. Like, let's just go there. Or sometimes I'm just like, nah, we're going to grind this out and like make this work because it's good for the body. So I try to stay in the middle of that, but there's times where I'm more discouraged. I'm like, man, I don't know if we could do this. And there's other times where I'm like, yeah, we're going forward with this. So all over the place.
CCM being Christian contemporary music, right? Yeah. Just for listeners, if you're hearing CCM, all that's great, man. I love hearing your perspective on all of that, and somebody that serves alongside you a lot. I've grown a lot, and I mean, I'm honestly in a place of kind of like I just outlined is, culturally, I grew up playing a lot more CCM music, and that's just more my comfort zone musically, but have thoroughly like enjoyed it. At this point, feel like something is missing when we're not doing, more of the gospel songs, with the caveat of like somebody that leads some of the time, like, typically I'm like, I need certain people, or a handful of other people with us to help us implement the songs. I was like, I can't, like I said, my forte is, some singing and acoustic guitar, occasionally some bass, and I'm like, I can't play certain songs as like the main,
Yeah.
person up there. And so like I love that though.
And
Like I love that those are some of the good growing pains of doing kind of the things we're doing together.
and I want you guys to know I see that and I hear that. Like, I don't want to just go the whole time with you guys feeling like, dang, we're never doing good enough. Like even you guys trying, and some of our white brothers and sisters like embracing that, to me means a lot. It's like, this is tough. We could just go do what we've been used to, and for people to prefer another person's background that means a lot. One of the other challenges, and this goes way beyond music, but music helps. Like when you're talking about preferring other cultures on a Sunday morning or all throughout the life of a church, a part of that is you have to have the members to accommodate or to look to.
Right.
And so whether we like it or not, a lot of times music is something that people come to church for. As a worship leader, I try to instill that in our worship team, that's not actually the goal, but it's inevitable that people will come to church, sometimes based on the band. They will come sometimes based on what they hear. So the challenge in that is, number one, like when we're trying to do really dynamic songs, you got to have the musicians that can do that. Either they're there in the church or you're training people, which takes time. And that can be frustrating when sometimes people come, say they look like me or they're from another minority group, and they don't see or hear their culture represented. They're like, let's go try another church. And so even just like retaining, like people coming back is a constant challenge.
Right.
Because we want to grow in that, both the visual representation of who's on a worship team and like the style of music and the genre.
Right.
But it's hard to build that out when we're not quite there. And then people come and they're like, oh, this doesn't really represent who I am. And then they leave. So that's another challenge that we just pray through and we're trusting the Lord in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think another good problem that I've enjoyed experiencing a little bit is I was talking to one of our members or brothers at the church and trying to get them to consider joining the worship team, and that is not English, and this person's used to playing music in a different culture that we're talking about, which is what we often do is white church, black church, but then so many other marginalized communities get lost. And like you're saying, we're never going to perfectly represent everybody, but I hope that people that, come to spaces like ours feel like can understand our heart to want to do the best we can. And so with this person I've been talking to, the main pushback was like, well, I'm used to playing this way and, in this language type thing. And the backdrop being like, that's not necessarily how you guys play when you're up there. And that I was glad to be made aware of that, because I'm like, no. Like, I understand, like it's not, but it's because we don't have your culture represented on the team yet, which is why, like, look, would you consider, being part of this? Because that's a good problem to have, because I'm like, I that's valid. Like, your culture is not represented up there, but we're also growing. We want that. It's not because we don't want it. It's because we don't have it. And so it's a good problem to have, because I'm like, this person there isn't even because of that, but I can understand, like, if I'm represented 0 of the time up front, it's like, I might consider going somewhere else. So I think that's an example of hopefully a good problem to keep running into.
Yeah. And I think I know who you're talking about. But even in that challenge, there's little challenges, like don't leave, because there may be somebody from your culture and your background that comes and they see you and they're like, oh, this church cares about,
and I loved
diversity and ethnicity and culture.
Yeah, I think you know who I'm talking about. I
more than
don't
I've seen,
permission to
and
use
they
their name,
may
but I also
stay and
loved
join.
like
Yeah,
on Easter we had multiple languages represented, reading scripture from up front, and I love that it's people that we didn't just look out and say, "Oh, you speak a
for
different
sure.
language, let's throw you up there." It's people that we know very well that have been with us for a long time. That I loved seeing them being represented from up front, and then specifically even people that maybe were visiting on an Easter Sunday, seeing, okay, these people are part of this church. It's not perfect by any means, but they care about representing, you know, my culture. If they're even just there for Sunday in a real authentic way. Last thing, I love if you have any thoughts, but there's kind of four of you guys that rotate through preaching up front, and I love the contrast between that as well. Like you mentioned, our guy, brother Dave Giddings, got you, and then we got Pastor Vince, Pastor Michael, all four very, very different preaching styles, and I love that as well. What are some of your thoughts, aside from the music, when you preach, and then even thinking about the other elders that preach? Like, how do you? I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts on how to be your full selves when you're preaching as a pastoral team?
Yeah, that's really good.
Mm-hmm.
This is something we focused on. We started what we call Connect Lunches, and we're going through a book in church as it is in heaven, which
Yeah.
very much focuses on ethnicity, culture, generational gaps, all the areas of diversity in church. And one of our last sessions was talking about the differences in worship and preaching and how we try to bridge that gap. Yeah. And I think that it was received really well at that. I wish more people could come because you get that broader vision. But I think it helps that, one, we're so close to each other that we can say how we really feel. So if we're uncomfortable, we can talk that out with each other. We can learn stuff from each other's culture, from each other's background. I've really enjoyed having a plurality of leadership.
Right.
And one thing that I've enjoyed the most is we're pretty much black and white. So what you talked about a little bit there, we haven't built out a team where we have a ton of other languages or countries represented. But it's one of the biggest blessings is having white brothers that get the struggle. They understand some of the things we're wrestling with, some of the challenges, and they're able to speak up on our behalf at times, which is one thing for a black male to talk to a predominantly white group about some of the challenges, but it comes off way different. It comes off way different when a white male talks to his peers about some of the challenges that black males may face. So I think that's dope and life-giving.
Would you be willing to? Yeah, I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off. Would you be willing to? I'm just thinking for our listeners who might have this question, like even just an example of something that you have brought up to. You guys said you're all very close, but something that has been something that you've even had to, you or Dave has brought up to Pastor Michael or Vince that's been, I don't know, not a point of contention, but something that has been helped you guys grow as the black men preaching and in front of a large white audience that you've had to feel like you want to make them aware of something that you're struggling through that was helpful for them to understand?
Yeah, well, one of them it's not. It doesn't fit perfectly into your question, but it was actually a way that I was surprised, like at the very beginning, and both Michael and Vince, they kind of brought up the idea that we're gonna persist in continuing to bring this up because our natural tendency is to forget about culture and ethnicity and move on to more important things, whatever that means, right? So when they brought that up, that was like a comfort for me. It was like, oh, these guys are committed. Like they're not just trying to chase the tokenism or, we've we've got that title of like this really diverse plurality of leadership, but like we're willing to every month, maybe even every week, bring it back up before our minds to let you know that we're thinking about this and we're not going to give up on that vision. So for me, that was life-giving because they said that not only to us, but like to other peers in the congregation, maybe even in spaces where they didn't know we could hear or we were aware. And that was like, that's dope.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I'd second that, and personally as well. Kind of saying that. Would you say that? Because I heard you say you were even surprised, like it was encouraging in solidarity with you, but it was also encouraging. Would you say because I'd say you're saying like you were almost conditioned to be okay with less, I guess, like when like you know what I'm saying. So like almost. Because that was a surprising thing that almost I feel like gave you an extra boost of, oh man, they really are in this with me, even though I probably would have kept just moving on if we pivoted and they weren't as in it as I thought they would be. I would say that's accurate, that might be a solidarity that's super powerful.
Absolutely. I think the norm would have been, to answer your question, yes. The norm would have been we have to bring that up as a result of something that had happened or multiple experiences that we maybe ignored. And finally it came to a head. We just had to bring it up. But for that to sort of be the start of our journey before we even get into anything or anybody feels slighted or less than, for that to be in their mind without us having to bring it up, I think that was a comfort. It was like, okay, we're not just saying multicultural, multi-ethnic. We're going to commit to doing that. And I think that helps tremendously.
Absolutely. And man, we're blessed with not just on leadership, but a lot of amazing brothers and sisters, white brothers and sisters in our church that have been just a huge, huge blessing in the Lord's grace in our community. Because you talk about there, it's very diverse, but also a largely predominantly white congregation. But it's been fantastic, and I only bring that up because doing things like you're saying, EL, with like a Pastor Vince, Pastor Michael, continuing to double down and persist and bringing up stuff like racism from up front. Like we're acknowledging that we want that, but we know that on their end, and they're not looking to be pat on the back in any way, but it's a risk and it's costly, especially as we're establishing a brand new church. And so even just the willingness will affect their paycheck, it affects attendance, all these things. Like we're laying into that, they are laying into that of like, look, if that's what happens, it's worth it, because of the relationships and the calling that we've all said we're about. And so walking it out is very, very powerful. I appreciate you sharing all that. All right, let's this is still gonna be in your wheelhouse, EL, but let's pivot to something else. So as I mentioned, former D1 athlete, receiver at Virginia Tech, football player. Not that you can't hoop and dunk on my Radford students' heads, occasionally mine, on the court too. I want to shout them all out, but I won't. But look, let me ask you some about the state of college sports for a second. You're obviously still in that world a lot with FCA. But Matt, what are your thoughts on, because there's a lot of justice themes below the surface here. What are your thoughts? I wonder what your personal thoughts are on this, depending on how highly recruited you were. But NIL, so name, image, and likeness. What's the word? Permissions, deals are permitted, I guess, now. And for people who don't know what that means, is I don't even know how long it's been. A few years, I guess. But before NIL became officially a thing, it seemed that before that, if a college athlete, even sniffed money, they're expelled or something, big, like they're done, expelled out of the university. Now, fast forward after a lot of conversations about this topic over the years, for decades now, it feels like players, from my point of view, can make as much money as they want as a college athlete off of their own name, image, and likeness. And so there's been lots of criticism from one end of, well, this is ruining college sports. This is all downhill from here. Coaches are retiring because they don't like the culture shift, all this. And, on the other end, I'd say that it's the player empowerment age now, of that players can now take responsibility and, make a living off of their own name when they couldn't before. I'd wonder what your thoughts are. So I'll ask, I guess, a basic question at first. Do you think that NIL, the transfer portal, all that kind of stuff is a good thing? And I'm assuming there's going to be some nuance, but a good thing overall for the state of college sports?
Man, what a good question. My first thought is I wish I was selfishly able to make some of this money.
You might have had a different career, my guy.
Yeah, things may be different, but I trust the Lord's plan. I don't know that I'd be on this podcast if I was if I was able to. So, I don't know that I can say it's good or bad. Well, honestly, to answer your question, it's bad to the state of college sports, but maybe that's kind of the point, like to change the state and to kind of rebuild something different. So I think whether that's overall a good thing or a bad thing just depends on where you're at and who you are. To the players, it's pretty, at least up until this point, if you're a really good player, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think it adds pressure to coaches, but they're getting paid quite a bit of money anyway. So I think it adds pressure to the smaller universities or even conferences. It could be a thing where players kind of just use smaller programs to build up their name and then go where the money is. So there's negatives to it. But when you talk about player empowerment, if universities are making millions on the backs of players, I think there is something to be said about being able to give some of that back to, maybe not even some of it, a lot of that to who's producing all this revenue. So there's a ton of good. There's a ton of bad. I don't think I can perfectly say without seeing how it'll look in the next 3, 5, maybe even 7 years. So I'm still pretty neutral on it.
Right.
I think from a Christian perspective, because what I do is really all based on helping athletes see the bigger picture, their relationship with God through the lens of sports. I think there's opportunity. So I ain't answering your question cleanly, but there's opportunity to encourage stewardship and thinking about what really matters in the midst of a ton of opportunity and financial conversations and developing your future and all of that. So
that's a fantastic pastoral answer.
I think that's how you have to look at it. Yeah.
I don't mean that condescending way. I'll give you some. I'm a little more opinionated on it, and I have some leeway to be able to do that. I don't want to get you in any hot water. I'd wonder what you think about this. Like, from my perspective, following this conversation over the years, off and on, I see it as I think that we have that college sports has overcorrected, and they allowed too much too quickly and didn't think through the consequences of that. But I think that it is making it too simple to say that this alone has ruined college sports, because to me that's ignoring that there was anything wrong to it a little bit. Like, maybe that was the point. Like, to me, I just want people to understand, like, a lot of what the NCAA, how it was functioning, is in a corrupt way, in a sense that maybe that's too forward for people, but like it in a way that was really just benefiting the richer to get richer at the expense of athletes. And a lot of times they're the black athletes, like in football and basketball, the more high profile D1 sports. And I think that like that's an issue, like for, like I said, a player, high school or I'm a college football or basketball D1 player, to before, if they just accept a meal from a booster or something, they could get expelled for just doing that, all while not being able to make any money on their own. But every round in the NCAA tournament that the team wins, the coach often gets 6-figure bump, and that's not even the coach's fault. To me, that's just there's something wrong, and this is clearly at someone's expense. So to say that was like that represents the purity of the game before the NIL stuff, I'm like, that's just not true. Like that's not true. So players can do whatever they want, whenever they want, and go to 3 or 4 different schools. Like, I think that, to me, that is not great, because I think that does kind of like, well, man, then there really is like zero loyalty. And again, the loyalty thing is the same conversation too. Like, well, are the schools loyal? Who knows? But I don't know. I think, to me, there's got to be some middle ground, like some parameters. But absolutely, I think that players should be able to make money off of themselves if a university money, and they're not seeing any of it. So I think like that's just like an interesting conversation for me. So I'd wonder what you think about that. Was I out of line?
I think you're no. I don't think you were out of line. It, like you said, there's so many sides. You can look at this from a university perspective, a coach perspective, a player perspective, even players' parents. If we even zoom out to like the state of the economy, like I think a previous argument in this was how a college degree is really valuable, and it's still pretty valuable. It's still I'm not going to diminish that, but it might be
right.
It is completely different than maybe it was in the 80s or 90s, right? And you kind of look at the trend of like maybe a master's degree is kind of what the old bachelor's degree used to be like. And so it kind of feels like as the economy has bloomed, even what athletes were compensated with previously, which might have been good enough or okay, seems to have diminished over the years. So I think there is something to be said on the player side of like, I've had players come and talk to me, and they're like, I don't have enough money on the weekends to get, lunch. I got to wait till the calf is open. And I got friends who are making hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
And so they're having to base their decision on like, should I be loyal and just stay broke or like jump into this opportunity? And I'm like, man, that's tough.
Right.
I can't just tell you no, like just stay loyal and stick it out. And if there's opportunities, I'm not going to say that's the right move in every circumstance, but it adds some nuance to it that you have to start looking at this from multiple perspectives and seeing what players are really struggling with and what the coaches are thinking through now and how the universities are responding. I think there does need to be some restrictions on how players can move and how often they can move or where they can move to, and maybe some visibility on what's happening. Maybe if that looks like contracts or something. I don't know the right answer, but I know this is a great opportunity for players, but also it's just like a free market, and it's kind of hard to keep everything fair. So I hope I said that without picking a side, but you can kind of see where I land.
I mean, it reminds me, as you and I follow the NBA a lot, but people's outside perspective, these guys just are, these NBA players are greedy millionaires. They just need to be, thankful they're playing a game and getting paid millions, or when they negotiate their contracts, they're just greedy. They're not satisfied with them. It's like, well, look, they're not hurting for anything. Like, no one thinks that. They get paid millions and millions and millions of dollars to play basketball or whatever sport. But you got to at least understand, to me, like the basic finances of like how the league works. It's like, that it's rich billionaires paying them that money. So that's not like it's a, it's, if they're not getting the money, it's staying in the pockets of somebody even richer. There's a lot more nuance to it, but it's like, you got to understand where this is coming from. They're negotiating with somebody even above them. They're not negotiating because they don't think they can feed their families on $200 million. Mostly, I mean, I guess there's some exceptions, but yeah, man, I agree with all that. I'm sure that you got your work cut out for you being on, on a D1, essentially coaching staff, like processing like these thoughts even. And you even mentioned the possibility of players using smaller programs than going to bigger ones. Like, I feel like I see it all over the place. Like, just like, I'm in Radford, I see students, from big programs to our smaller program, and, vice versa. I feel like I see that everywhere. So I feel like that's even another example of how it's just, man, it's kind of chaotic. Like, I don't know where so-and-so's going. Oh, they went there? What? I didn't, like, that's kind of a lateral move. Why'd they go there? Why'd they go down there? Or, how could they change from that small school to the best school in the country? That's crazy. So yeah, it's interesting to me. I think there's a lot of nuance there. I hope it does get a little more cleaned up so that it's not quite so much chaos. But I also empathize with how long college athletes have not been able to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, another part of me is thinking about like the transparency from the university side or the coaching side. Yeah, I think that's something that needs to be improved, because it's easy for players to overestimate their value. Let's say maybe you're not a number one guy on a high major team, and a school is promising you something that they can't fully fulfill, and you leave thinking I can go and make X, Y, and Z, and you're stuck in the transfer portal.
Right.
I mean, you just kind of ruin the trajectory of your career, which for me is like, how can we both empower players and protect them? Because some of it is, there's only X amount of spots in the country for teams, and there's way more players that are looking for those spots. And so, particularly for me at Virginia Tech, but also just across the world or across the U.S., I want to see players protected while they're thinking about things like stewardship and loyalty and their relationship with God, but also having that access to the stuff that they make through their name, image, and likeness. So it's complex, ton of angles, but interested to see 3 to 5 years what's changed. Are we going to have super conferences? Who knows? But it'll be interesting to see.
Oh man, I didn't know. I don't even know if that's a possibility. What does the super conference mean?
Maybe the conferences are kind of designed to create protections for the universities and every member of that conference, and even for the players in different aspects. So with the trend, it could be just like kind of the rich get richer. It's like one big super conference, and there's kind of the dissolving of the Power Five and the smaller conferences to like one big pool of. Yeah, so who knows? That could not happen. It could be really soon. We just don't know.
Wow, man. Another problem coming with the fix. Man, that stinks. Real quick, thoughts on, man, what are your thoughts on this year specifically, man, the rise in the women's game in college and the WNBA. Like, I'm gonna call myself out, man. Like, just discounted the women's game for so long, and I'm amped to watch some WNBA this summer.
I'm gonna call myself out too. I haven't done a good job in the past, but I've been shocked by it and love
Yeah.
it. Shocked at how quickly it, and I know this has kind of been growing over the last few years anyway, but particularly with women's
Yeah.
basketball, collegiate women's basketball, and to see the effect they've had in such a short amount of time, and the viewership and the sponsorship and the amount of revenue that they're able. I think it's. I don't have a daughter yet, but I just get excited for the state of women's sports, women's basketball in particular. But to see it bloom and to think that, okay, a lot of stuff that they have been praying for a long time, and I'm joining in them. I'm joining with them now. Shame on me, but a lot of stuff that they've been praying for is starting to come to fruition. So we got to keep building on that.
Man, I'll kind of end with this. Like, if you want to see, if you guys want to see, listeners, the WNBA, NCAA, like, women's game, like, grow, the best way to even be a little activist is just watch. Like, watch the sports, like, the money.
Have a watch party.
Like, watch. Like, that's the best way.
Bring 15 people and watch.
Like, I think a lot of times we want to have, talking about stuff like these conversations, and we want to be these, like, forwarding these causes, but that literally won't do anything if I'm not in the games, because that's where the money's at, and that's why things like that are going to grow. Like, shows on TV are going to get canceled, like really good shows, if you're not watching. But if you're spending time, you know, like me, I often do, is talking about, like, oh, there needs to be more representation here, there, and there. It's like, oh, but did you watch that? No. I was like, oh, well, that's why it got canceled. So, man, just look, spend some time sitting on your couch watching some amazing basketball. This summer, that game will keep growing. And I think back to, I think you might even know her, but my friend Alethea has been on here a few times, and I had her on. Yeah, shout out Alethea. I had her on, I think, last year. Her thoughts were simple. She's like, look, it's just advertising. The game is good, but what do you think is going to happen if they're putting them on, you know, at, 1 o'clock in the afternoon on, a weekday? Like, no one's going to watch. Like, if they get the right promo, that's all it takes. It's going to grow. And, like, man, shout out to her, because that's what happened. Like, they give them a good spot on TV. They get them in good commercials. It helped that they had some amazing players this year, just headlining everything. But, man, it shot up. Like, I think this upcoming year is going to be huge for the league and the women's game overall. Like, I think people are going to be locked in. It's going to be crazy.
Funny story about Alethea.
Let's hear it.
She is part of crew still. I'm assuming.
I think just recently not, but she's still doing ministry.
Yeah, so we used to do kind of walk alongside of one another in ministry. Her with AIA, Athletes in Action, and we would do cross training. We would do FCA and AIA together, and for a few years we did that. And I can remember after I graduated and kind of came on staff, we would always have staff pickup. And basketball, football coaches, staff all across the campus would play all the time. And she came one time. We just invited her, and she was dropping. I was
gonna say,
crazy.
Tell me she broke her ankles or something.
I mean, just handing out. Oh my! I think we were on the same team, if I can remember. But I was her biggest cheerleader. I was like, give Alethea the ball, because she's not missing. Yeah. And she was killing it. So
shout out, Leith.
I was able to watch firsthand Alethea killing some of our staff. I should have took some video.
I've never been able to hoop with her, but that does not surprise me in the least. So shout out, Leith. Shout out women's game, college athletes. I gotta let you go. EL, appreciate you. This is your wealth of knowledge. I love this conversation, so we'll have to have you back. Listeners, yes, sir.
Appreciate you for having me.
Listeners, thank you as always for listening. The music you're listening to is done by our guy Dylan Dent. Our artwork was created by Ashley Bush. And we'll see y'all next time.
The nightmare might scare you, no worse than reality. They hunt you by day, R.I.P. Ahmaud Arbery. Everybody got a time, but that's less than comforting. I hope I'm alive by the time they choose to comfort me. Mosquitoes in the vein, or leeches on my soul. This money on my mind is a fracture in my bones. You get crippled by continuing existence like a ghost. And they wonder why we drink, and they wonder why we smoke, and they wonder why we think that everything's a joke. I'm shocked that we can sleep, must be the thought of letting go.